Good morning.
Morning, sir.
How are you?
Fine, thanks, sir.
I'm fine. Today we're going to have our lesson on African nationalism. You can peruse on page 172 of the textbook so that we proceed with the lesson of the day. Right. Our lesson today is going to be on the rise of African what?
Nationalism.
African nationalism. Okay. But now before we get to that, the rise of African nationalism, it's important for us to define the concept of nationalism. Okay.
Yes.
The concept of nationalism. Okay. Who can try to tell us what is nationalism? Yes, Mauba. The love that one has for the country is Rahalagan. Is one's love for? Yes, great love for one's country. Let's continue. Now we say here what I've written down. We say nationalism is an idea or is an idea of belonging. An idea of belonging or a feeling of extreme what? Extreme patriotism or the love for your country. That's what we refer by nationalism. It's the idea of belonging or a feeling of extreme patriotism for your country. Or we can generally say nationalism is one's love for their country. Right? But now, let's look at where does the concept of nationalism originate?
Yes.
Which group of people started this concept of nationalism? Again, now we are going to look at the fact that the concept of nationalism, they say it originated in France. In France during the French Revolution. Do you remember the French Revolution in 1810?
Yes.
Yes. It's when France was under the rulership of Queen Louis the 16th, right?
Yes.
King Louis the 16th and his wife Queen Marie Antoinette. So in France, the people of France, they say here, during the French Revolution, they stood against the rulership or the leadership of the king. And that's where the concept of nationalism originated. And also it expanded to Italy during the rulership of Benito Mussolini around the 18th or 19th century, somewhere there. Now, let's go back to the main topic of the day, which is the origin of African nationalism in South Africa. Right? We say the origin of African nationalism in South Africa. Right? The origin of African nationalism in South Africa. Now, here we are also going to look at how white people have been responding to, how black people have been responding to colonial or rather white domination So here they say, history teaches us. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Do you understand?
Yes.
Yes. Now, we say African nationalism hope you got it going. In South Africa, in South Africa, dates back, it dates back to the 1800s. Again, it dates back to the 1800s when wars. It dates back to the 1800s when wars of resistance against wide expansion into the area, into the interior were fought. Now, remember, in South Africa, during the years 1800s, or rather the 18th century, was characterized by a series of wars, either between the British and the African people, or the Afrikaners and the African people. Because it was at a time when European expansion, when we refer to European expansion, we are simply referring to the expanding or the movement of the Europeans from where they have settled. For example, from the Cape Colony into the interior of South Africa. As they move from where they have settled upon their arrival into the interior, that period is what we call the colonial expansion. So in the 1800s, is where we had what we call wide expansion into the area or into the interior of South Africa. And as they were moving into the interior from the coastal areas, they met along the road some black people. And in the course, what they were doing, they were fighting. For example, they met the Xhosas, the Zulus, the Sothos, and etc. So that's where African nationalism started in the context of South Africa. When black kings, for example, under Moshoeshoe, where black kings where black people under King Moshoeshoe, where black people under Shaka Zulu, when black people under then the rebel king of Mzilika were resisting or were united to fight against white people. That period is what we call, that period characterizes the commencement of African nationalism in South Africa. Do you all understand?
Yes.
Yes. Now let's continue, and I'll give all of you a chance to ask questions, right? So in essence here, when we speak of African nationalism, when we speak of African nationalism, again, we are simply referring to a response of African people against colonial domination and oppression. Again, and oppression. So African nationalism, remember, we say that nationalism refers to what? An extreme patriotism, or one's love for their own country, or is an idea of belonging. Now, African nationalism, it was a response to, or rather a response of African people against the colonial domination and what?
Oppression.
And oppression. That's good. Now, let's go and look at how did black people organize themselves to resist colonial, or rather, to resist white domination. Again, let's look at what is it that black people, not only black people, but also the colored community, right? Also the colored community. Remember here we say already, African nationalism is a response of African people against colonial domination or oppression. Okay. Now, let's look at how did those people resist or respond to colonial domination and oppression, right? The first organization that we are going to look into is called the African People's Organization. That's good. The African People's Organization. They say the NPO, when you abbreviate it, is going to be APO. Again, they said the APO, it was formed in 1902. Again, it was formed in the year 1902. And it was formed to protect the interests of the colored people. To protect the interests of of the colored people, right? Of colored people. It was formed to protect the interests of the colored people, right? So now we say that this is the first organization that we are going to look into. Then again, they say at its inception, look, the colored community was also oppressed. Again, oppression was not only meant for us black people, again, also the coloreds and the Indians, right? But the coloreds realized that in order for us to be independent, we need to have a body outside these common bodies that we have, or rather, we need to have our own independent institution. Again, that's when they established what? The African People's Organization. Again, now let us look at the aims of the African People's Organization, right? Let's look at the aims of African organization. Now, let's continue. The first aim, we say, it was to improve education for colored people. For the colored people. That's good. Why do you think it was aimed at improving the education for colored people? Why do you think it only aimed at improving the education of colored people only? Yes. Now, why do you think so? Can someone try to tell us why was it only for the coloreds, not also the Indians and even Africans? Who want to try? All right, yes, Vincent.
Because they were considered as a nation.
Yes, because the organization was formed for a specific nation, which is the colored nation, right? Now that is also part of, or this is one of the indications of nationalism. Now we proceed to the second point. They say to extend the right to vote. To extend the right to vote. Black people, coloreds, and the Indians, we have always been denied the right to vote by the British and the Afrikaners, those who conquered the African communities and took over the local governance and etc. They denied us the opportunity to vote. So the African People's Organization, they wanted wanted the right to vote. They wanted the colored community to vote, right? Now, we then proceed again to those who supported the African People's Organization. Again, they say it was mostly supported by the educated and the middle class colors. Again, middle class and the educated colors. Again, now the African People's Organization, it was formed to protect the interests of which nation? Of which nation? The color, right? Now, we look at, let's fast forward now. Remember, it was formed in 1902, right? Now, 10 years later, we have the formation of the South African National Native Congress. When was the South African National Native Congress formed? In 1912, right? Not 48. In 1912, South African National Native Congress is what we now know as the African National Congress. Again, it was originally formed in 1912. Again, yes. It claimed at its inception. Let me just quickly erase here. Formation of the South African National Native Congress. We say it was formed in which year was it formed?
1912.
1912. Again?
1912.
In 1912. That's good. Now, it was formed in 1912. And it claimed to represent black, or we can say Africans. Again, it claimed to represent Africans. Again. Yes. Then in 1924, this South African National Native Congress. In 1924, it changed to the African National Congress, right? The reason why at first it was called South African National Native, the word native means a black person, like an indigenous black person. So when it was formed, it was only for black people. But in 1924, they said, no, you know what? Let us change the name of this organization. Then they renamed it to the African. The word African simply means the organization belonged to anyone who was an African, especially those who were oppressed, the Indians and the colors, including black Africans. Do you understand?
Yes.
Yes. Now, also, the last point, we say this organization, it emerged from the dissatisfaction of black people. That these are the of black people and other Africans who participated in the South African War. You remember in grade 10 you learned about the South African War between 1899 to 1902. The war was between the British and the Afrikaners. We had black people participating in the war. Some of them were scouts, some of them were messengers, and some of them were spies for both some the British and some the Afrikaners. But after the war, the British and the Afrikaners, they both did not take into consideration the interests of those black people. Then that is where now the ANC emerged. So many people fought in the war, but as a result, they were dissatisfied with their living conditions after the South African War. Is there anyone who has a question? Any question? Gulam.
Why did white also oppress colored and not Africans only?
The reason why there was not only an oppression between colors, there was an oppression not only of Africans, is because of the fact that in the formation, for example, of the Union of South Africa, or when we look into the history of colonization, is the fact that we had a situation wherein Africans, Indians, and including the colored, were considered less humans in the history of colonization. That's why now they were also oppressed. Not only African people were oppressed. I saw another one with the hand. Yes.
Okay. What was the importance of the formation of the African People's Organization?
Alright, we say the African People's Organization was formed in 1902, right?
Yes.
And the reason why its formation is important is because of the fact that we also had a group of colored people who were oppressed, right? We also had a group of colored people who were oppressed. And as a result, the colored people saw it fit for them to create the African People's Organization. Again, the reason why they created the African People's Organization is because they wanted to protect their interests, and most importantly, they wanted to improve their own education system, because the education that was given to them, it was not of quality according to them at that time. Do you understand?
Yes.
Do you all understand?
Yes.
Well, I saw another hand. Yes, Goody.
How did the African People Organization and the African National Congress come about?
Yes. As I've said here, in 1902, remember the African People's Organization was formed before the SANNC, the South African National Native Congress. This one, it was formed by the colored people. Then the SANNC, the South African National Native Congress, at its inception, when it was first reformed, it was mainly for the natives, the indigenous blacks, but it later changed to African National Congress, which now accommodated everyone. Do you all understand? Which now accommodated everyone. Did I answer your question? Anyone who also has, yes?
Sir, is the APO and ANC the one thing?
The African People's Organization and the ANC are not necessarily, and they are not the same thing. This one was for the colored people. Even when it was founded, it was meant only for colored people. But this one, it was meant only for the natives, right? But later, it changed to African National Congress, which now accommodated every African. Do you understand? Which now accommodated every African. Is there anyone with a question before I finish? Yes.
What happened to the organization in 1920 and 1930?
Which organization, Matangu?
Account for its position.
Which organization?
Of APO.
Alright. Now, we say again, the organization of the African People's Organization. The African People's Organization, again, around the 1930s, ANC was gaining momentum in South Africa. And as a result, We had also some of the Indian communities trying or rather joining the African National Congress. And now this, it also led to the African People's Organization losing most of its followers. The reason why this is so is because the NPO only accommodated the colors. And when the ANC, after they came to African National Congress, now most people began to be interested in the ANC. Why are they interested in the ANC? Because now it accommodated for all those who were oppressed. Whether you are a colored, you are an Indian, or you are an African. As long as you are a human being and you are oppressed by the colonial regime, the British or the Afrikaners, you were given the right, you were at liberty to join the African National Congress. Now, you are going to open on your books. You are going to have a brief classwork for 5 minutes, and the classwork is not going to be long. You are going to have a brief classwork, right? And we are only going to do it in 5 minutes. Then we are only going to do it in 5 minutes because of, right? Because of some other things. Okay? Then they say here, number one, list 2 aims. These 2 aims of the African People's Organization. Again, this is the first one. The second one says, define what is nation, define what is nationalism. Number 3 says, discuss the origin of African nationalism in South Africa. Discuss the origin of African nationalism in South Africa. You only have 5 minutes to write this activity. You can proceed. You can proceed and write the classwork again. We only have 5 minutes of our time. In the meantime, let me prepare for correction on the slide. Let me prepare for our corrections. Verderings 2109 2021. We are only left with 4 minutes, man. 4 minutes. Just a small, quick, and easy activity. A small, quick, and easy activity. If you are done, you can raise your hand. We are left with 3 minutes. Yes, Mahir is almost finished. Mahir is almost finished. Yes, Maufa is finished. We're left with 2 minutes. From then we proceed with our corrections. Point number 1. Alright, let's go. Again. Are we all done?
Yes.
Are we all done?
Yes.
That's great. Clap hands for yourselves. Now, they say list 2 aims of the African People's Organization. Who wants to give the tribe? Yes, Batangu.
To improve education for character.
To improve education. To improve education for colored people. Again, the second aim is important. To extend the right to vote. Again, to extend the right to vote. Again, what is nationalism? Yes, Rahalalan. Great love for one's country. Again, who also has a different definition? Who has a different definition? Malepa, your hand was up. Malepa, your hand was up. Alright, yes. Now, number 3, they say discuss the origin of African nationalism in South Africa. Yes, to give everyone in accommodation, not really. Anyone who wants to try. The origin of African nationalism in South Africa. Remember, I mentioned something about the British, the Afrikaners, and how black people were resisting the colonial expansion by Afrikaners and the British. Who wants to really try? Yes, Nguni.
When the British and the Afrikaners manifested themselves here in Africa, they came up with some ideas that they were there to oppress black people. That's why black people had to grow something, and then they came with this thing they call African nationalism. That's how African nationalism manifested itself.
Thank you very much. Let's get hands on Nguni. Yes, that's good. Because during colonialism, black people also resisted what? Colonialism. They resisted white domination. And as a result, they united amongst themselves. And that was the official commencement of African nationalism in South Africa, or rather the South African national black people united themselves against colonial expansion and fought wars of resistance. So black people united themselves against colonial expansion and fought wars of resistance. When we speak of wars of resistance, it's when the British wanted to take control of certain lands of black people, and as a result, black people fought back. That's what we refer to as a form of resistance. Do you all understand?
Yes.
Do you all understand today's lesson?
Yes.
Our lesson for today Our lesson for today will officially end here. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you.